Okay, so I have started recording. Just, just a little bit of background. First of all, thank you guys for joining us this afternoon. If you haven't logged into the previous Zoom series, my name is Taylor Denman, and I am the Carter County Ag Educator and a multi-county forage specialist. A little bit about extension. We are a free resource to people across the state of Oklahoma. There is an educator in every county, and we can kind of help you facilitate or answer any questions as far as agriculture, natural resources, horticulture, lawn, trees, gardens, anything like that. We are a free resource to you. Our next Zoom series is going to be on beekeeping, and that's going to actually be on June 13th. So it'll be the second second Tuesday in June. We actually had a little bit of a scheduling conflict with that. So we did have to move that one to the second Tuesday in June. And so for today, we'll be talking a little bit about pecan management, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the testing services that we offer here through the Extension office. So we have Miss Becky Carroll, who's going to kind of have a little bit of a discussion with you guys. She is an Associate Extension Specialist for fruit and pecans through Oklahoma State University, and she provides support for county educators, programming through fact sheets, current reports, and workshop opportunities, as well as helps with Master Gardener training. She worked closely with the Oklahoma Pecan Growers Association to assist with workshops and field day plannings and implementation as well. So, Miss Becky, if you want to take it away.
All right. I think I'll go ahead and share my screen if that's all right. See if I can do that, and then we can talk about what's happening here. All right, can you see it, or is it? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so I know there's just a few people on here, but does anyone have any specific questions, or can you tell me a little bit about what you are involved with pecans, if you have pecans, if you're interested in maybe getting started, or just that would help me kind of have a place to start from and go tonight. So if anybody has you can unmute and we can talk about your operation or possibility. Or if not, I'll just go ahead and start. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to just kind of go over a little bit about pecan production and the value of pecans in the state. And so if we look at the average production per acre for varieties or improved pecans, planted type of orchards, we're looking at maybe between 800 and 1,500 pounds per acre. And if you get much more than that, if you start producing like 2,000 or 3,000 pounds per acre, the quality can go down really quickly. Now, some other parts of the country, like New Mexico and Arizona, they can produce those 3,000 pounds per acre, but they have a lot more sunlight intensity, and things just grow differently. Our humidity and the lack of sun through the season, sometimes it can reduce our production. And so 800 to 1,500 pounds an acre is probably an average for varieties. For native pecans or pecans that are grown in the wild, they are naturally occurring seedlings that were planted by streams and rivers and squirrels and other things. We look at production. Some years there may not be any, but other years between 400 and 800 pounds per acre is what we would expect on a managed native grove. Average wholesale price per pound, it varies greatly from year to year, but on varieties over the last 10 years or so, it's averaged about $1.97 or close to $2 a pound, and natives are around $1.25 a pound. Now, if you sell directly to the consumer, you're able to set your prices a lot better. Those $2 and $1.25, those are wholesale prices selling to accumulators. So they're buying up large amounts of pecans. But if you're going directly to the customer, then you can sell at a more consistent price and set your own price for your area. So maybe $9 to $12 a pound for a cracked and shelled type of product. And then if you go into value added, you can do all kinds of things and just keep your profit going up. But it does take extra work. So if you look at this little chart here, the orange in here, this is the native production, and it ranges from about 20 million pounds down to less than 5 million pounds on that 10-year average. I do have a chart from 1944 up until current time, and then if you look at the improved, it's more consistent, and that's because normally they are managed more intensively. We can do things like crop load thinning and different fertilization programs, irrigation, so we have more of a steady production. And then if you look at pricing, the black line is the native and the blue line is improved, so you can see how it moves up and down from year to year. And you would think that would have to do with supply and demand, but not always. So sometimes there's some different kind of factors that are affecting those prices that we see. Now, one thing that, it's hard to talk to a group without knowing exactly what you do or what you have, or if you have trees at all. But the first step is to assess where you are and what you have. Is it a native grove? Has it been managed previously, or is it just totally wild? And so sometimes, it's going to just be never managed at all. So it's just wild growth. Sometimes there's lots of non-pecans and lots of shrubs, poison ivy, all kinds of things that are growing in there. Or is it mostly pecans? And what percentage of pecans do you have? Because sometimes that makes a big difference on if it's going to be feasible and economical to go in there and clean up a native grove to make it work as a native option for profit. If you don't have enough pecan trees on that acreage, then it may not be really economical. Or is it a planted orchard? Is it just a few trees that were planted? Are they managed? Have they been managed recently? Are they overgrown and having some issues? Are they planted in rows or random spacing where they've been maybe cultivars grafted onto native rootstock? Are they very tight, or is there a lot of space in between the trees? Pecans need a lot of sunlight to produce really good quality. And then, is it overgrown? Some of the old orchards that I see are just filled up with calorie pears and with red cedar and all kinds of things. So they can be overgrown, and it might take a little bit of minimal cleanup. And if it's an orchard that you bought from someone, do they have a map or a plan that can actually tell you what was grafted in that area? Or you might just have a few landscape trees, and there are a few things you can do to help with those productions, but not a lot we can do for pest management when we have landscape trees. So, do you have enough acreage for equipment ownership? That's a big investment in sprayers and harvesters and shakers and all of that thing, those different types of equipments. And so, we normally think of an improved orchard having maybe around 40 acres to be feasible to own some of that equipment yourself. Or you may think about hiring outside management. Maybe you have a neighbor that has an orchard or a grove, and they might be interested in hiring out to do some of the spraying and the harvest for you. You can also think about leasing your grove or your orchard, and that generally comes with different kinds of contracts. Have to set up who's supplying fertilizer, who's supplying the pesticides, those kind of things. And it's usually a split, maybe 80-20, where the person that's leasing the land gets 80% of the profit or the production at the end, and the landowner may get 20. But it all depends on who's providing what. So that has to be worked out between the two parties. So for typical management pecan programs, when we think of low input, we think of native pecans or small cultivars. They're usually going to require minimal fungicides and insecticides. Maybe a couple of weevil sprays is all we're talking about. And then they usually have lower nitrogen and potassium fertilization. We have infrequent or usually no fruit thinning, and that's done in August is when we do crop load management. They're not irrigated. It's not economical to irrigate a native grove, and a lot of smaller pecans can fill well with less water. So no irrigation on those low input. Normally it's going to the sheller, so it's a wholesale market, and a lot of the time we include grazing in those groves as well. So we have two different systems going. We have the cattle grazing and we have the pecan management, and those two work well together, but they're two separate plans that we have to consider. So a high input is more of a large cultivar or a retail pecan that's going directly to the consumer. And sometimes, depending on the cultivar, they might require up to 8 fungicide applications in one season. Not all of them do, but some of them are going to require a lot. And it depends on the weather that season a lot of the time. We encourage people to use an IPM program where they're doing integrated pest management, doing monitoring and scouting, and using thresholds for their insecticide applications. We usually see higher nitrogen and potassium fertilization. We encourage fruit thinning on those, especially large fruited cultivars. We want to have orchards in moderate to well-drained soil. Many people think that pecans do really well in wet areas, but they'll survive and live in those areas because that's the native range. But if you're trying to establish an orchard, you need to have moderate and well-drained soils. They're going to do so much better. We want an area that doesn't flood frequently. If it floods during the fall, you've taken care of that crop all season long. We get a flood come in and it might just take out all of your production in that one flooding event. And it also keeps you out of the orchard when you might need a spray or other type of things as well. We want to look at ground cover management, maybe doing some clover establishment, maybe doing some other type of forage work. We think about irrigated orchards when we're looking at large pecans, premium market, and no grazing. Grazing and high input doesn't fit very well because a lot of the pesticides that are incorporated are not grazable. So we have to look at that as an option. So developing a native grove, it's not a simple process, and it's not just going in there with a bulldozer and taking out every other tree or something. It takes time, and it's a multi-year process. So if you look at that picture there, you know, there's a lot of pecans in that area, but you're going to have to select the best ones to leave, and that's not always an easy task. So the first step, if you've assessed that you have enough pecans to make it viable, then you would remove any non-pecan trees. So anything that's not a pecan is coming out. And so we don't want to leave oaks and you know, elms or anything else. Everything comes out. All the shrubs, all of the poison ivy, all the undergrowth, that all needs to be cleaned out. So we smooth up the ground anywhere maybe a bulldozer or mulchers pushed out a tree. We want to make sure that that ground is the surface is smooth, because we're going to be running equipment over that. If it's rough, it's not going to work very well. So smoothing the ground, correcting any water drainage issues, maybe an area where water might stand, build some type of area where it will drain out, a drainage area where it goes through the creek or a lower space. And then identify your orchard floor vegetation. Are you going to go back in and plant it with something, or are you going to rely on native grasses and weeds to come back into the area that's been cleaned up? So that's your initial work. Then What's left, you want to study a little bit. You can remove very large trees. If they're too large to put a shaker around, then they're not going to be easily managed. They can get too big around to actually harvest. And so it's very difficult to take out those very large trees, but it's ideal to leave some young and large trees all in the same area. We want to take out anything that may be hanging over a creek or over the road. Those aren't harvestable areas, so those are not useful trees. If they have multi-trunks or they're split or something like that, we want to remove those as well. If any tree was damaged during that initial removal, those are candidates for coming out as well. And if you notice that there's a big area where maybe there's a squirrel den or something where the wildlife are living, those might be also trees to remove pretty quickly. Then you want to watch and remove them slowly over the next couple of years. So we want to monitor the trees and look for their disease susceptibility. Normally natives are pretty resistant to a lot of the diseases. But if we see one that gets pecan scab really bad, it would be first on the list to come out. Another thing that a lot of growers do is they will, each harvest season, they'll take a can of tree paint and they might put a dot on that tree if it has a crop. Or if it doesn't have a crop, they may put a dot on it. And then they look at that over the next 3 years. And if it's got 3 dots of no crop, then it might be one that could come out and leave the ones that have more consistent yields. Taking out those with weak or poor structure is also important. And then also looking at nut size can be very important. Pecans can be so small that they are just not sellable. So those are not going to be very beneficial to our yield. So overcrowding is probably the most limiting factor in native pecans. And if you think about a big pecan tree, if you've gone in and thinned an orchard, or if you've seen that, they'll be really tall and skinny and just a little bit of canopy on top. But a nice, healthy pecan tree should have a canopy that goes the whole way around that tree. And that's because they need a lot of sunlight. When pecans get overcrowded, they start dropping limbs. So they're self-pruning. And so we want to have nice full canopies, and that requires sunlight. But also when pecans are really crowded, their roots probably go out time and a half again as tall as they are. And so when they're crowded and the roots are intermingling, then they're competing for water and nutrients as well. And like last year when we had such droughty conditions, having an overcrowded orchard just makes that much more stress on the trees. So we look for things to thinning criteria. We have a 30 square feet cross-sectional trunk area per acre, and that's measuring the trunk about 4 foot high. And there's a way to figure that. There's a fact sheet that I could point you to if you're interested. Or a simpler way, maybe to just look at the orchard floor at noon during the summer. So we want to have 50% shade, 50% sun on that orchard floor at high noon. And so if we have too much shade, we know that it is overcrowded. We want to reduce the number of trees. And also we can look at the canopies. If they are touching or intermingling the canopies, we know those trees are too crowded. So we want about 10 feet between canopies to have good thinning spacing. And thinning is not only for native pecans, it's also important for planted pecans as well. And so in the plans, you have to plan for that thinning to come to play in about year 20. But if we have nice open orchards, this is going to be beneficial to the forage, to the livestock, to the trees. It's going to help with airflow, reduce disease pressure, and it's just going to be a much healthier grove overall. Now, if we're looking at a new planting, we're looking at an area we might want to plant to an orchard. We want to really take a look at the land that we have or the potential land we might be buying to plant. And so we want to look at the soil type and the depth of soil. We want at least about 6 foot of good soil before we hit a hard rock layer or a water table. If we have limited soil depth, those trees don't have very much soil to take up nutrients and water. So we want to have good soil depth for a good productive tree. Water availability and quality is important if you're going to be using irrigation. And air and water drainage is also important. That top picture is in the northeastern part of the state where water backs up into this orchard when some of the lakes flood. And so that's not great for the trees. When the pecan trees have water setting on their root system for weeks at a time, they'll start losing those roots. They'll start declining and losing root growth. So, but also you can't get in there to spray, you can't get in there to harvest or anything. So it's not an ideal situation. The bottom picture is at the research station at Perkins. It's on a very nice slope down towards the river, and the air drains really well. So when we have cold spring events, that air is like water. Cold air settles into the low spaces. So if we plant on top of this hill, the cold air is going to settle away and fill up those lower areas before it affects maybe our bud break in the spring. We also want to look at location. Is it close to you? It's very difficult to do management if you're not able to be in the orchard area very frequently. We want to look at orchard design, and also you need to think about your overall goal, what you want to accomplish. And that fact sheet, establishing a pecan orchard, it sets all of these different things in play, and you can take a look at how it's describing how to set that up. So pecans, they need about 54 inches of water per year to produce a quality yield. But, we don't get our rainfall at the times that we might need it most years. So it's really nice to be able to supplement that rainfall. And so especially like last year when we were in a drought, we were at the research station, we have lots of water and the ability to irrigate. So we were able to supply our trees to during those important irrigation events or stages in the growth of the pecan. So we really want to have good watering during the sizing stage. And the more water those pecans have during that June and July timeframe, the larger the pecan is going to be. Now, if you don't have water in the August and September time, then they're not going to fill out very well. So it might be better to have a smaller pecan and then use your water to fill it out in the fall. The other important time for water is during that nut filling stage, when they are filling out with the kernel. If we don't have enough water, they'll be wafery. They just won't fill out or be good quality. And then we also need water during the time when the shucks open. It's a process. They have potassium. That water is drawn to that shuck, and it pops those sutures open to allow it to be harvested. With the drought this last year, a lot of the shucks didn't open properly, and so that was because of lack of water. And so that really affected the yields across the state. And then we also had a early fall freeze that froze those shucks closed. So we got a double whammy on the shucks this past fall. So that's kind of an important thing to consider if you're growing larger pecans. Variety selection, that's a toughie. And it kind of depends on where you are, your goals, if you're selling retail or wholesale, if you're going to irrigate, if you have really good soils, if you're going to be able to spray and manage fungal diseases, lots of things to consider. And you also need to think about pollinators, because pecans they need cross-pollination. So you need to have at least 2 different types, one an early pollen shed and a late pollen shed, but it's best to plant maybe 3 or 4 different types to cover those pollinator needs. If we don't have enough pollen shed at specific times, we just won't have a crop set properly, and our yield will be much lower if we have a yield at all. So we need to have complementary cultivars working together. So orchard design, this is kind of a normal setup of 40 by 40, which equals about 27 trees per acre to start. And we want to set it up where, think about when you're mowing and spraying and harvesting, stay away from fences and creeks and things that may impede your travel through the orchard. It doesn't do any good to go right up next to a fence if you can't turn around that tree. It just won't work right. Also, our pollination, we talked about that. About no further than 8 rows, we want pollinators. So we'll have different variation on setup of those blocks, but we want to keep them within 320 feet of each other. And then be sure that you consider those tree thinning that will happen about year 20. You may be taking out every other tree, and you want to make sure that you're not removing your pollinators during that first thinning time. All right, so one thing that's really important, and people I don't think give it enough emphasis, is how you plant your pecan trees. And so we normally plant bare root pecan trees. They're dug in the winter, and they have a very long taproot. A lot of the time, the trees may be 8 or 10 foot tall, and with a root that may be 4 or 5 foot tall. Very, very large trees. But we've done research, and we found out that cutting the taproot back to 18 inches is the best depth for planting. If you go longer than that, you don't get as good of return root development. So we're going to dig a hole 18 inches deep, no deeper, because we don't want that tree to settle. And we're going to prune the side roots back. Anytime you prune those roots, making fresh cuts, it initiates new root development. So it's a good thing. So dig your hole. Put your pecan tree in there 18 inches deep, and we want it at the same depth or more shallow than it was at the nursery. I like to have one of those roots right here, maybe even exposed. That is key. If this trunk is never going to grow roots on it. And so we want these roots right along the soil surface line to be our brace roots. They're going to keep the tree strong and upright. The taproot will redevelop and be our anchor, but it's just there for that, an anchor. Those other side roots in the top, maybe 3 or 4 feet, are going to be your workhorse. That's where they're taking up nutrients and moisture in that top part of the soil. So we're going to put our tree in there, fill it back in with that native soil that was taken out, water it in really well to get all the air pockets out, and then that tree is going to be cut back about halfway. So we've reduced the root system of the tree. We're going to reduce that top of that tree to balance it out. And that tree is going to take off and do really well. So what happens if you plant them too deep? Well, this picture right here, over on the right, you can see there's a space right there. And that tree is just wiggled back and forth, just wobbles around in that hole because there's not any brace roots right here because it's trunk tissue. And so that tree is never going to be as thrifty or productive if it was planted where it should be, flush with that soil surface. And then when we get big windstorms or in areas where they have hurricanes, then they can just fall over, and it happens too frequently like that. So planting depth is key to keeping a very strong upright tree. So after we've planted them, we're going to start developing that new planting in place. Maintain our moisture level by irrigation, but also by weed control. We're going to have a fertilization program in place, and it's going to include foliar zinc applications. It's key to getting good, healthy foliage, lots of leaf tissue and shoot growth. And then we're going to do our training program starting that year when we plant it. So I'll talk about these a little bit. So why is weed control so important? Well, weeds include anything that's planted where it's not wanted, right? That's what it means. But in this case, weeds include fescue, Bermuda, other grasses, and broadleaf plants. And so they're competing with our trees for both moisture and nutrients. But through research, we found out that they also they exude chemicals from their root system that inhibits the growth of the trees. And so we did some studies at the research station several years ago. This bottom picture shows the beginning. It was a solid stand of fescue. We planted pecan seedlings in with some with no weed-free area, some with 3 foot, some with 6, some with 12, and some with 24-foot diameter circles. Kept those weed-free. And then we monitored the growth, measured the growth of the trees. Those that had no weed-free area were, a lot of them died or was stunted. The 3 foot were much smaller. And the 12 and 24-foot diameter circle trees, they grew faster, larger, and they started producing sooner than the other trees. And they produced more pecans even after they started producing. So weed control is extremely important. It's more important than water or nutrients. And here's the picture above. They'd been thin, but you can see that we kept the circles going for many years. Here's another picture. We did another study where we had a pecan tree. We either kept it clean, or we had one primrose on each side, or one pigweed on each side, or we had a primrose and a pigweed. And you can see the shoot growth over 3 years in feet. So the no weeds grew 54 feet total, where the primrose were 41, pigweed 28, and if you had one of each, only 11 foot of growth. So almost an 80% reduction in tree growth. So it's a lot for just a few tiny weeds. So we can use herbicides, pre-emergence, post-emergence. We can use mulches. We can use fabric mulches. There's many different ways to control those weeds, but we need to do something to keep them managed and under control. Fertilizer for the first year after planting, we don't put anything out until that tree begins to grow. When it has some nice growth, maybe 1/4 to 1/2 pound per tree of some nitrogen fertilizer. I like to put it in a band about 1 foot away from the trunk of the tree, and that's all we're going to do that year, except we are going to be spraying the trees with zinc sulfate. And we apply that every 2 weeks until July. And that's really important to get good, healthy growth on your leaves. Year 2, right before bud break, we're going to put about 1/2 pound per tree of something like triple 13. And then a few weeks later, maybe 1/2 pound per inch of trunk diameter of nitrogen. And put it in the same way, just out in a strip about 1 foot away from the trunk of the tree. Continue the zinc sulfate foliar sprays as well. Year 3, very similar, just bump up the rates a little bit. And we also are going to collect leaf samples in July. And I know Taylor's going to talk about plant tissue samples a little bit later as well. Year 4, we're going to take the results from those leaf samples, that tissue sampling, and it's going to tell us exactly how to fertilize our trees. So it'll say you're sufficient in nitrogen or you're deficient in nitrogen, applies this much. So it gives you an idea of exactly what that tree is able to get up from the soil and is in that tree. As they age and get older, we also want to, especially for phosphorus and potassium, we want to band it out in a band, even like using a spreader like this, a big spreader, fertilizer spreader, just turn off the whirligig and go down the drip line and apply your fertilizer in a band. That speeds up the phosphorus and potassium movement in the soil, and it really is helpful on getting it to the tree more quickly. Continue with foliar zinc even on mature trees, maybe 3 times a season. It's incorporated with maybe another spray that you're applying at that time. Leaf sampling is not difficult. We sample in July, we find the middle leaf. Remember, pecans have compound leaves, so we find the middle leaf on the shoot, and we take the middle pair of leaflets, collect 50 pair, rinse them off, put them in a paper bag, take them to the county office. Make sure you designate if it's a native or an improved cultivar. And for $20, you'll get a tailor-made, and if you take it to tailor, it'll really be tailor-made recommendation for how to fertilize your pecan trees. For training pecans, we want to have a single trunk, a single leader, one central leader. And this makes a very strong structured tree. We want our scaffold branches to come off at a 45 to 90 degree angle for the best strength. And we want them about a foot apart. If you're running equipment through your orchard, you may have to cut those off depending on the height of your tractor. And so that's where your first scaffold branch will start. But you can see on this tree at the top, it had 2 leaders right at the top. And so one of those leaders has to come off, because eventually, if those 2 continue to grow, they push each other apart and it will split out when it gets a big crop on there or ice storm or something like that. So we want to maintain that central leader as long as we can. There's a fact sheet that talks about training pecan trees and keeping them at that, having that central leader structure. So here's a before and an after. This is kind of an oops, because this tree should have been pruned several years ago. But you can see what's wrong. It's got 2 main canopies, right? If we left this to grow like this, it's going to eventually split, and it'll split all the way to the ground. We'll lose the entire tree. So what this grower did is he cut off half of that canopy. Now the tree is going to be grow much better. It's going to have many benefits to the tree. It's going to hurt you much worse if you wait and have to prune off half of your tree like that. But that's what it takes, is to get that one main leader. So this picture shows you what the lack of training might have happened. You can see this tree right here. There was 2 leaders at the very top, and all this tissue right here that's in the middle, this is dead. That bark doesn't ever knit together. So it's bark that's included in that. And so that's a great place to form rots, because you get wet in there and it's just dead bark. And so whenever we have an ice storm, big windstorm, or a heavy crop, something's going to happen that looks like that. And oftentimes it goes all the way to the ground. This shows one grower's his progress. This was in March. He had all these multi branches on this one tree. He pruned it back to 1 leader, leaving 1 scaffold branch. And in August, this is the same tree. You can see that 1 scaffold branch coming off. It did great after that pruning. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some insects and diseases. Pecan phylloxera is an insect. If you see these galls, there's not anything you can do about it this season. Flag that tree and know you'll need to spray it next year when you have just maybe an inch or 2 of new growth coming out after bud break. And so an insecticide just on those trees, not the entire orchard, but just on those that are affected with phylloxera is needed. Pecan nut case bearer, or PNC, is a moth that they lay eggs when the nuts are very small. The larvae then feed on the little small pecans. This is called frass or bug dew. And so you can see that since the pecans are so small, they can reduce the clusters by quite a bit just because they can eat pretty quickly. So we monitor for PNC by using pheromone traps. So we have the trap, we put them out in early May. So this is a perfect time to be putting pheromone traps out. The pheromone is actually a little rubber septum that has the attractant of a female moth. So we're catching the male moths in our sticky trap. And so we want to when we catch enough of these moths in a sequential days, we know that it's time to start scouting about 12 to 16 days later for egg laying or for damage to those pecans. And this normally happens the end of May. Most people are spraying either end of May or the first part of June. So this is what the damage looks like. There's this webbing or the frass or these tiny eggs. And this is the flower surface, the stigma, the little bitty tiny area of that pecan. So you can see the eggs are very tiny. So we're gonna, when we scout, we count 310 clusters. I like to have a little clicker. And when if I get to 2 eggs or 2 damaged pecans before 310 clusters, it's time to spray. If I get to 310 clusters and I only have 1 egg, I don't need to spray. So I need to, we're have a threshold of this. There are 3 generations, but we don't get as much damage in the second or third because the pecans are much larger. We recommend using a caterpillar specific insecticide like Intrepid or Confirm or BT. It's not going to kill all the beneficial insects that are out there helping you, but it's going to take care of these caterpillar pests. Now, when you spray for PNC, you're also taking care of some other insects that might be in your orchard as well. Fall webworm, walnut daytana. The webworm feed inside the webbing. The daytana, they strip the leaves on the terminals, but they look like these little fuzzy gray caterpillars. So those are some things that if you're spraying for pecan nut case bear, you get some overlap and you don't have to worry about these leaf feeders as well. Aphids, they are out there on the leaves. They are mining those sugars from the leaf, and then they're excreting them as honeydew, and that causes that stickiness or the drippiness that if you have a pecan tree that you park under, you might get drippy spots all over your car, and that's honeydew or those sugars that are being extracted and then excreted from the aphids. There are 3 types. We have yellow pecan aphid, the black margin, or the yellow black margin aphid, or the black aphid. And they have different, the black aphid causes this type of damage to the leaves, or it can cause defoliation. The threshold for spraying for aphids on the yellow types is 20 to 25 aphids per compound leaf. So that's that entire leaf. But for black aphids, if you find 2 on 1 compound leaf, then it's time to spray. They're just that much more of a problem for the pecan trees, can cause defoliation. Stink bugs, they're not developing on the pecan tree, but they are on maybe host plants around the trees like thistles or alfalfa, soybean, or millet. And so when something is harvested or mowed, those stink bugs can move up into the pecan tree. So if the pecan is fed on by the stink bug during the water stage, it causes this black pit or that kernel to abort and drop from the tree. If it's at the dough stage, when the pecan is actually filling, then you get these black spots and they're very bitter and it makes that pecan inedible. So that's those are the kind of damage from stink bugs or leaf-footed bugs. But pecan weevil is our main pest. They overwinter, or they stay in the soil for 2 to 3 years. And then when we get a big rainfall or irrigation event in July, they start coming out of the ground. And so most of them go up the trunks. And if they get up into the trunk and it's in the water stage, when you cut the nut and it's liquid, they'll feed on those and the nuts will drop to the ground. If they're in the dough stage, they can start laying eggs in those pecans. So this is what it looks like after the larva had fed. When they finish their life cycle, they chew a perfectly circular hole, drop to the ground, and start the process all over. So if we don't stop that cycle, it keeps building up that population under our trees. A lot of our growers use these circle traps that circle the trunk of the tree. And they put them on areas where they have sandy soils or a tree that always has weevil. So when they catch a weevil in the trap, that's an indicator that either they need to spray or they need to be thinking about spraying. And if they're not catching weevil, they don't need to be spraying. You can use these in a home situation to reduce the population just by trapping and killing those weevil over several years' time. But you're not going to get all of them, but it can be helpful in a home situation. Disease control, plant resistant varieties, timely fungicide sprays, increase your airflow, good sanitation, and having a healthy tree is all part of having a disease-free tree as well. Pond scab is our main disease, causes black spots on the leaves or the shucks, really worse in wet, humid years, and can cause leaf drop. The quality can be poor on the kernels, or the shucks may not open at all. All right, so at this stage, when they're green shucks, those pecans are not ripe. And so they're still susceptible to freeze, and they have very high moisture content. If we do get freezing conditions like we did this year, they will be frozen in the shuck, and they're not usable at that point. You can't peel them off. But once those shucks begin to split, that signals that that nut is mature, ready to be harvested, can be released from the shuck. It'll start to dry down, and we recommend using early maturing cultivars to avoid this freezing in the shuck. Harvest, if we wait for the wind to knock them out of the tree, it's going to be extended time. And one crow, one squirrel can take about a pound of pecans a day. And there's never just one crow or one squirrel. So we want to get them out of the tree in our possession as soon as possible. For homeowners, a tarp and a long cane pole, knocking those out when the shucks open is the way we want to harvest those, to get them quickly. They may need a few days of drying, but they're really going to be the best if we can get them early. Commercial growers have shakers, harvesters, pre-cleaners, and they do a lot to get those in on a timely basis to reduce their loss to wildlife as well. Wanted to mention the Oklahoma Pecan Growers Association has a conference coming up June 1st through the 3rd in Tulsa. Thursday, there's a mini pecan class. Friday, we have an educational program, and Saturday is a field day. So if you're interested in coming, there's their website. You can check it out. Look at the agenda for the educational program. If you're interested in CEUs, we'll be having 3 during the event for pesticide applicators as well. And then most importantly, these are pecans and these are not. That's what I wanted you to leave with today. Here's my contact information. I have a web page and a Facebook page if you're interested in learning more about pecans. So anybody have any questions? I know I put out a lot really quickly, but anybody have any questions about pecans in general or anything specifically?
You can feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat box if you would like.
You're welcome, Lauren. Thank you. And if you think of something later, you're welcome to email me as well. So I'm always available for questions.
I do have a question. How feasible is it for the homeowner who has just a handful of pecan trees to do the zinc foliar application? How do they do that?
It's not very easily done. If they have a sprayer that can get up in the middle of the canopy and spray zinc, it can help. But they're not going to get full coverage, but it can help those lower branches. But if they're looking at trying to spray fungicides or insecticides, it's just not, it's not very easily done for a homeowner. So that's why, make sure you're using disease-resistant cultivars, do those trappings, and even to hire someone to come and spray a yard tree is very difficult because it's an edible crop. And so a lot of those people that do lawn maintenance, they would have to have a separate license for those edible type of crops as well.
Okay. Gotcha. And then you said those circle traps, they can be of some benefit to a homeowner?
Yep, if you
That's
put
right.
those
Okay.
on your pecan trees in your yard, you just have a couple trees, then you can reduce that population over a few years. Now, if your neighbor's not doing anything and they have a big population of weevil, they are very mobile, so they can fly. They're pretty large insect. And so, you know, you might give your neighbor a present of some weevil traps or something if they don't do that. So
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. And then had another question and I forgot.
it's all right.
Forgot what it was.
All right. Well, my webpage has all the fact sheets available. It also has a lot of videos from Oklahoma Gardening and Sunup, and also some webinar recordings from 2020 and 2021. And they're divided by month and topic. So if you have something particular you want to look at, you can look at those webinars. We had different specialists talk on those, and really good information to go back and look at later as well.
Okay, that sounds good. We actually usually send out an email after, so probably tomorrow or within the next day or two, kind of as a recap.
Okay.
So we can make sure to kind of put those links in the email as well, just so people have them
Sounds
for
good.
their for them to look at on their own time.
All right. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated.
All right. I'll take care.
You too. Okay, so I will be your next speaker. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. And share my screen. Excuse me. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you guys just a little bit about some of the testing services that we do through OSU Extension. So like I said earlier, there is actually a county extension office in all of the counties in Oklahoma. So no matter where you're at, you do have access to a county educator or an office that can kind of help facilitate these different tests that we do. This is just kind of a breakdown of the different tests that we do, looking at, the different general boxes and the pricing as well. It's not too expensive to do any one of these tests. It's not a couple $100 or anything like that. It's, $10 here, $20 here. Some of them are $6, $5, that kind of thing. And you get a lot of information out of these tests if you were to do them. So starting out, I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil testing that we do. So the main ones that we do are going to be the routine soil fertility, and sometimes we'll do organic matter, and then sometimes we'll do soil texture as well. We get a little bit of greenhouse media, and then soil salinity and comprehensive salinity. A lot of times people will do those if they're trying to plant something near an oil well. Sometimes there can be some excessive salt in those areas, so they just kind of want to make sure that's okay there. Sometimes we'll get, if there are issues with plants and the soil fertility looks pretty decent, we can start looking at secondary nutrients and micronutrients as well, to try to kind of figure out what's going on with those plants. So just in general, what is soil fertility? It's the soil's ability to provide essential nutrients in adequate amounts and proper proportions to sustain plant growth. So a lot of soil fertility is going to be influenced by different management practices, in addition to a lot of other things like the topography, the type of your soil, the pH of your soil, and the climate and weather can affect the fertility of the soil as well. So the three things that we get from a routine soil test, which is going to be far and away the main soil test that we do, the three main things we get are soil pH, and then nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and we also get a buffer index as well. So the reason that soil pH is so important and making sure that we have the appropriate soil pH for whatever it is we're trying to grow is that it is kind of what we like to think of it as the master nutrient or the master variable for nutrient uptake and availability. Typically, you know, in the eastern part of Oklahoma, you're going to have a little bit more acidic soil. The western side is going to be a little bit more basic of soil. And plants tend to prefer, in general, plants tend to prefer a soil pH of slightly acidic. There are some plants that can kind of tolerate more basic soils or even more acidic soils, but in general, it's kind of more of that slightly acidic scale. And the reason for that is because at a slightly, so if you see this red box here, at a slightly acidic, so a little bit lower than 7, is when most of the nutrients that are required by plants become available in the soil. So not all the nutrients that are in the soil are available at any point in time. It depends on that pH of the soil. So again, getting to that slightly acidic level, you start seeing a lot of those nutrients becoming available. The more acidic you get, the less available some of these nutrients are, and then the more basic you get as well, the less available some of those nutrients are. So the three main macronutrients that we kind of look at for a routine soil test is going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is important, and that's going to be one of the big ones when it comes to yield for plants, for your garden, for your pasture, and things like that. It's going to be an important component of amino acids, which is going to be building blocks of the proteins. And nitrogen is typically pretty mobile in the soil. So a lot of times what you'll see with fertilizer recommendations is, you know, split applications or a couple applications throughout the growing season to apply the nitrogen because it leaches out of the soil pretty quickly. Phosphorus is another one that we look at for a routine soil test. This one's going to be important for photosynthesis. Phosphorus itself is actually going to be a little bit bigger of a molecule. It's not going to move in the soil as much. So you won't have to apply this a couple times throughout the growing season to get the best benefit out of it. You'll only have to apply it, you know, once every year, every couple years, depending on the soil test. The third one we look at is potassium. That's going to be the main one for perennial persistence. So if you have Bermuda grass pastures, for example, that's going to be an important one to help it persist throughout the year and be able to recover from dormancy. This is another one that is also fairly immobile through the soil, so you may not have to apply it every year, similar to phosphorus, and you wouldn't have to apply it multiple times throughout the year. But basically what we do for our routine soil test is once we get our information back, we'll send it off to the lab, we get the information back, and then each county office can go in and actually make fertilizer recommendations for you based off of what it is that you're trying to grow. Soil texture is another test that we can do apart from the routine soil test. This can kind of give you an idea of what type of soil you have. So kind of looking at this soil triangle, the test that they do will give us a percentage clay, percent silt, and percent sand. And so then we can kind of go in and look and see, you know, for example, what's considered a clay loam. That can kind of help you with your management practices, kind of help you determine how readily nutrients and herbicides and things like that can kind of move through the soil. So that's always kind of a fun one to look at. This is also a big deal in construction as well, you know, just making sure if you're building on like a sandier soil versus a heavy clay soil. Soil organic matter, that's another one that we can test for, one of our main ones that we test for outside of a routine soil test. So soil organic matter is oftentimes seen as it can be a measure of soil health. And so this is going to be kind of that living fraction of the soil. It's going to have some carbon, it's going to have some bugs and that kind of stuff in that soil organic matter. And soil organic matter actually helps hold moisture and helps hold nutrients in the soil for those plants to be able to access. So that's another one that we can kind of look at to see if you're improving the organic matter in your soil, or if it's starting to kind of go down, and you can adjust your management practices accordingly. So like I said, for our routine test, we can look at the primary nutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you start seeing issues, even though your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are at pretty decent levels, that's when we can start looking at those secondary and micronutrients. So you can see on this list here, there's quite a few different nutrients that plants require in very small amounts. And so this is just to kind of show you, if you start seeing different nutrient deficiency symptoms, you can kind of go through here and see, you know, NP and K are the big ones, and then some of those secondary and micronutrients as well can cause similar deficiencies. So a soil test is only going to be as good as the soil sample that you provide us. So I just kind of want to go through a couple steps on how to do that, how to get that done and getting it done properly, so we can make sure to get you an accurate result, accurate recommendations, so you can kind of see some management and some changes happen. So step one, you know, the importance of a soil fertility management program. The reason that you would want a soil test is, you know, poor soil fertility can be a common cause of poor establishment of vegetables, of pastures, all sorts of different crops. Could be as a result of pH, or, you know, the NP and K that we talked about as well. It can also be a cause of poor persistence. So like I said, potassium, for example, is very important for Bermuda grass persistence. That also plays a role in drought tolerance as well, the fertility of the soil. So when you take a soil sample, it gives you a better idea of the nutrients that you have in the soil, so you can fertilize appropriately, not over fertilize, not under fertilize. Helps you identify the nutrients that are lacking, and then adjusting your pH. Again, pH is going to be kind of that master variable that affects the availability of the nutrients that you do have in the soil. So this here, this little probe here is called a soil probe, and most county offices, I would say, do have a soil probe to loan out to people. So if you wanted to soil sample your lawn, for example, you could go to the county office, you can check one of these soil probes out, and it's really easy to get a good sample of your lawn to bring into us. So just keep that in mind as we talk about how to collect a sample. Excuse me. So when it comes to collecting a representative sample, what you have to do is you have to get a sample that is representative of the top 6 inches of the soil. Okay. So if this is a field or a lawn, for example, you're going to want to make sure to get a sample that's representative of that area. I like to tell people the number of samples you bring depends on how many ways you're willing, or how many different ways you're willing to manage your lawn or your garden. So if you're willing to fertilize the front yard separately from the backyard, then bring me 2 samples. If you don't want to go through all that and you just want to fertilize it all the same, then take samples from both, mix it together, and bring me 1 sample. So it just depends on how you're wanting to manage that, your lawn or your pasture, okay, or your garden. So this example here, take a representative sample. A lot of times what I do in pastures, for example, is I'll tell myself every 30 steps, take a soil sample. You do want to avoid certain areas that could have potential differences in nutrients. So areas where people feed hay in their pastures, a lot of times you're going to have a little bit higher nutrient concentration there that could kind of throw off your results. So kind of make sure that the areas that you're sampling are representative of the entire field, and kind of avoid those areas. You're going to want to take about 20 core samples, again, randomly as you can from that area of interest. 20 typically tends to be the threshold for a good soil sample, whether that's in a small garden, a medium-sized lawn, or a large pasture. Okay, so about 20 core samples, again, top 6 inches of the soil. Then you're going to take those samples and put them in a plastic bucket, and you're going to mix those samples up real good and get a good, nice, homogeneous mixture of soil. And then bring your county extension office 2 cups of that soil. Okay. And that 2 cups will give us enough to test for one soil sample. There's an OSU fact sheet that's available, and if we have time, I will show you the website where you can find a lot of these fact sheets. That can be helpful to you if you're wanting to do any sort of testing. So again, like I said, fields, gardens, lawns should all be sampled at a depth of 6 inches. The reason being is because all of the tests that they run at the soil lab are calibrated to the top 6 inches of soil. Like I said, you can submit those through your local county extension office. And then what we do is we package them up and we send them on to Stillwater. They give us data, and then we make recommendations based off of that data. Okay. Like I said, routine test is going to be what we do 80% of the time. Is going to give you pH, NP, and K, and then our recommendations will be attached to it. So the next kind of set of tests that we can do through the lab in Stillwater is going to be water testing. The thing with the water tests that we do is that it just evaluates general water quality. So it's going to look at mineral content, nitrates, salts, pH, things like that. Okay. So the test that we do, the lab that we send it to is actually not DEQ certified, so Department of Environmental Quality. So none of our tests are going to test for bacteria or heavy metals or pesticides or anything like that. If you want to test for those things, you would have to go through the Department of Environmental Quality. Okay. So basically what happens with that is if you were to submit a test to us, and I'll go over how to get a good sample in a minute. But basically you bring the test to us, we send it off. We get the results of all of these different components here. Again, those minerals and nitrates and pH and things like that. And then for the household one, for example, we'll get a comparison between the results of your test and the EPA drinking water limits. Now, a lot of these are going to be secondary compounds that pretty much just affect the taste and the mouthfeel of the water. But if you were to get it back and, your total dissolved solids, for example, are pretty high, that may be an indication that you need to adjust your water softener or something like that. Livestock, their drinking water limits are a little bit different. That's why we have a household versus a livestock. Irrigation is also important. pH, electrical conductivity, a lot of those things can affect the how hard it is on the piping for irrigation. So making sure that that's, in larger operations that have big irrigation systems, that would be important for that. You can also do a water test to evaluate pond water if you experience fish kill. And I believe that they do that under an irrigation test. Home brewer, I've never had to do one of those. So I'm not quite sure on how that looks, to be honest. But either way, if you do want to send us a water sample to get tested, the steps to collect a good water sample are, what I typically tell people is to take a brand new water bottle and open it up and dump out the water that's in there. And then if it's from your house, like your faucet, you're going to want to run that water for about 3 to 5 minutes. Then rinse that brand new bottle 3 times with the water that you're going to use to test. Okay. After you do that, you're going to want to take it and you're going to want to fill that water bottle all the way to the top with as little air as possible. And then you can bring that to us for us to test. For a pond, you want to make sure that the sample that you bring us is going to be representative of what the livestock drink, or if you have certain areas of concern, to sample those areas of concern separately. Okay. Same thing with irrigation water is going to be similar to household water, in that you're going to want to let that water run for a little bit and then take a sample. Okay. But just make sure that you have a new bottle of water, dump that out, rinse that bottle a couple times, and then take that sample from there. We also do forage and feed testing as well. We do quite a bit of this in when it gets to be about haying season. We've got protein only. We do basic. Honestly, I recommend basic over just protein only. Basic plus RFV is typically what you see for alfalfa. And then we can also do nitrate and a mineral test as well. So the reason that forage testing is important, forage and feed testing is important if you have a livestock, is that nutrient requirements change quite a bit in animals based off of where they're at in their production phase. So if you have, in this picture, for example, if you have 2 different lots of hay, we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you have 2 different types of hay that are 2 different qualities, then you can kind of mix and match and feed, the hay that's a little bit better quality at the time when they have a little bit higher nutrient requirements, compared to a little bit lower quality, when you've got a dry cow, you might could feed that during that time. And the way that this helps is that supplementation is really expensive when it comes to feeding livestock. So if you get the most out of your hay and you know what you're giving them from that hay, then you can kind of tailor it more specifically to what supplement you need and how much supplement you actually need to provide. So typically what we do with these samples is, once you bring in a hay sample and we get the results back, then we can actually go in. If you tell us, if you have cattle, sheep, or goats, you tell us what kind of animals you have, how much they weigh, where they're at in their production phase, then we can go in and we can actually make supplementation recommendations based off of that. So we can tell you, with this particular lot of hay, you're going to want to feed 2 pounds per head per day of a 20% cube, or something like that, depending on, again, the quality of that hay. So to sample your forages, you want to try to sample those as close to feeding time as possible. There are a lot of different factors that can kind of affect the quality of that forage once it's been baled, especially if it's been sitting outside and not under cover. So you want to try to sample that as close to feeding as possible. And you're going to want to sample each lot of hay separately. Okay. So in this picture here, if you've got, for example, one hay field and a portion of that hay field, it's the same hay field, but a portion of that hay field is, alfalfa with some grass in it. And then another portion is just a pure alfalfa stand. You're going to want to sample those separately. Okay. Because this lot 1 over here can have a completely different quality compared to lot 2. Okay. For every subsequent cutting, it's going to be another separate lot of hay. So in this example here, if you have the same hay field, you've got your second cutting. That one side over there is going to be that, if you've got grass infested alfalfa on one side, and then say it started raining halfway through as you were trying to roll up the hay, you would want to sample those separately, rain damaged versus the undamaged alfalfa. Okay. So basically, like bales, sample like bales together, and then for everything that's different, you try to sample those separately. Okay. For square bales, you want to have a minimum of 20 representative bales, and then for round bales, a minimum of 10 representative bales for that. So how to sample? I jumped the gun a little bit. So a lot of our, again, the county extension offices, they should have hay probes that you can check out and use if you want to sample your hay. So basically it's a long tube. This one's a little bit different than what we have in our offices, but it's a long tube and it's attached to a piece of PVC. And so you actually have to manually shove the metal sharpened tube into the hay and then pull it back out. And then that sample collects in that piece of PVC on the other side of it. So it does take a little bit of manual labor to do that, but it's definitely worth it. And you can contact your local extension office and they can get you one to check out to do so. So when it comes to sampling for a round bale, you're going to want to sample the rounded portion. So, don't sample on the sides, sample that rounded portion of a round bale. Okay. For square bales, you're going to want to sample the short side. Okay. Reason being is because if you're rolling up a bale of hay in a hay field, for example, as you're going through a windrow, you're rolling it up in a ball, basically. And so if you were to sample from the rounded side, you're getting a sample from several different places throughout the field, several different locations within a windrow. Okay. If you go in from the flat side, you're just getting one spot in a windrow. Okay. It's similar to that with square bales in that you get multiple points within a field if you go from that short side, and you want to try to get as representative of a sample as possible. So once you get your 10 or 20 hay cores to send off, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take all of that sample that you got and mix it all up. And then you're going to set it out in a pile, and then you're going to quarter it, basically. Okay, so you'll quarter it, and then you discard 2 halves and then save the other half. That other half is going to be what we need in our office to be able to send that to the lab. Okay, this says to fill a 1-quart bag. I typically like about 2 quarts, honestly. But we can, if it's a full, like a packed full 1-quart bag, we can get away with that as well. We can also do nitrate tests on that sample as well. Typically what we do for nitrates is if it's standing forage, we can actually do a nitrate test in the office. If it's a hay sample that you're worried about nitrates, we do have to send that off to the lab. So you will still need the same amount of forage to be able to do that nitrate toxicity test. But you would sample it the same way. Or if you have bales that you're more specifically concerned about with nitrates, sample those separately, and then we can run a nitrate on that. So the next kind of test that we can do is going to be the plant tissue analysis. This is going to be kind of one of our more expensive tests. It's about $20. And this is kind of what Miss Becky was talking about with pecans, is you can do a plant tissue test and we can make fertilizer recommendations for you based off of the results of that test. So the most reliable indicator of fruit and pecan tree fertility and its needs is going to be the chemical analysis of foliage, which is going to be what we call the plant tissue test. Typically, you're going to see this in pecans, peaches, and apples. And similar to the soil test and similar to the forage test, the accuracy of this test is going to be dependent on the accuracy of your sample collection. And so the lab has adjusted their results, and they've got it, lined out there in all of their criteria and how they get their data based off of a very specific way of sampling. Okay. So each leaf sample should represent a condition rather than a certain acreage. Reason being is, similar to soils, or because of soils, different parts of a field can have different soil types. For example, they could be low areas, high areas. There are a lot of different things that can affect the fertility and nutrient availability to a tree. So if you've got half of your fields looking a little bit more rough than the other half, you may want to consider sampling those as two different samples. So then you can get a fertilizer recommendation for that area that's struggling, and then a recommendation for the area that's doing a little bit better. This is a little bit tricky at times, so you're going to have to be the one to kind of judge the uniformity of your trees to determine how many samples you need to send for your recommendations. Now, I know this is a lot of words on this slide, but just bear with me. So the steps going through a tissue sampling process on, for example, your pecan orchard. You're going to want to make sure to do that in July, and don't mix varieties. So if you have several different varieties of pecans, don't mix those. Keep them as separate samples. For apples and peaches, 100 leaves for each sample. Pecans, 100 leaflets, and I'll kind of show you the difference between those in a minute. Kind of what I'm talking about with that, and that's per sample that we send to the lab. Okay. You're going to want to collect the leaves from shoots that are convenient from the ground and located on different sides of the tree. Okay, so don't pick it all from one side, and then don't collect any leaves from suckers or anything like that. Also, don't collect more than 2 leaves or leaflets from one shoot. And the apples and peaches, you're going to want to select from the middle of the current season's growth. And then for the pecans, you're going to want to make sure to do 2 pairs of leaflets located in the middle leaf of the current season's growth. Okay. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to remove the leaves with a downwards or backwards pull so that the stem actually remains attached to the leaf. And then avoid any leaves that have insect or disease or damage of any sort like that. And then you're going to want to collect those in, don't use a galvanized container, don't use rubber gloves, anything with rubber on it. That could cause contamination with those leaves. And then before the leaves wilt, you're going to want to wash them, kind of like Becky was saying, just rinse them off real good, get rid of some dirt, get rid of the residue. And then kind of let those dry out. And then you can put those dried leaves in a sample bag or a Ziploc bag and submit them to us. And I don't have a plant tissue bag here, but basically this is the size of a plant tissue bag, I would say. And we do have to have that filled. So just make sure you get enough sample to be able to fill that bag. But 100 leaflets should be good enough for that sample. These are pictures here just to show you kind of where to collect those samples for plant tissue. So like up here, pecans collect that middle pair of leaflets located on the middle leaf of current season's growth. So current growth, middle leaf set, and then the 2 leaflets in the middle of that stem, basically, okay? For apples and peaches, collect leaves from the middle of the current season's growth. So again, just the middle part of that new growth, just collect those leaves from there. We also do animal waste and compost tests. I have not done any of those here in Carter County. If any of you are interested and would like to do that, that is perfectly fine. We can definitely get that done here as well. A lot of times you'll see this with like poultry litter. They'll get some information on the poultry litter before they use it as a fertilizer or something like that. So that's definitely another option for you as well. So that's kind of a list of all the different tests that we can do. And like I said, once we get those results back, no matter what, if it's soil or water or feed or compost, once we get those results back, we don't just give you the list of the results to try to interpret. We do go in and we make those recommendations for you, make it a little bit easier to understand on what would be the ideal thing to do in that situation. And you're also feel free to reach out as well. If you still get the results back and you're still a little bit confused, you can always reach back out to your county educator and they can kind of walk you through that process as well. But like I said, with OSU Extension, like I said, there is one in every county. We are a free resource to you, with the exception of these soil tests, basically. The reason being is just because it does take time and money to run the lab that actually, comes up with the results of those tests. So, and with that, if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to put that in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. Okay. I don't see any questions. We'll do like we've done in the past. So you will get an email within the next couple days with a kind of a recap with some fact sheets and things like that linked. And then also the link to the YouTube channel for you to be able to watch the video on your own time as well. So if there's no questions, let me make sure. So if there's no more questions, like I said, beekeeping is going to be the second Tuesday, not the first Tuesday. So it's going to be June 13th is when we'll talk about beekeeping. We've got the economics of beekeeping and then the basics of it as well, from start to finish, how to have bee boxes. So, all right. Thank you guys very much. Look forward to seeing you next month.